Good evening. Welcome back, everyone. We have another very special guest here, Adama Delphine Fawundu, and Victoria Budadian, our faculty in sculpture, will introduce her in just a moment. So I will begin by saying we would like to acknowledge the land on which the University at Buffalo operates, which is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty of Peace and Friendship, a pledge to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. It is also covered by the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua between the United States government and the Six Nations Confederacy, which further affirmed Haudenosaunee land rights and sovereignty in the state of New York. Today, this region is still the home to the Haudenosaunee people, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. And with that, I'm turning it over to Victoria, so please join me in welcoming her.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Becky. I am very thrilled to have Adama Delphine Fawundu join us tonight. I first met Delphine years ago in Lagos, Nigeria. And a couple of years afterwards, I was a grad student giving tours at Columbia University. And guess who showed up for the tours? To get tours about the MFON program at Columbia, and it was Delphine. And the rest, they say, is history. So I'm really, really excited to have Delphine here tonight. And of course, since then, Delphine has gone on to do, lots of inspiring work. So it's been very inspiring to follow the dynamic ways that Delphine's work has gone and reached people globally. Adama Delphine Fawundu is a visionary visual storyteller. She's an educator and also cultural documentarian with roots in Sierra Leone and Equatorial Guinea in Africa. Her practice is an invitation to look deeply into the past, examine the present, and imagine the future. Through photography, mixed media, printmaking, and more, Delphine's work resonates with the strength and the resilience of African and Black diasporic identities. She amplifies the voices and legacies of African contributions and infuses her work with traditional elements like hair, textiles, cowrie shells, weaving a visual tapestry that honors cultural memory and Afrofuturistic perspective. Delphine's art brings forward complex stories of human interconnectedness, reimagined through spiritual and ritual practices. She co-founded MFON, Women Photographers of the African Diaspora, which has become a powerful movement and a testament to her commitment to representation. Delphine has won several awards, which include the Rema Mann Emerging Artist Award, the New York Foundation for Arts Photography Grant, the Brooklyn Arts Council Grant, and in 2024, she was named a Guggenheim Fellow. Fawundu's work can be found in public and private collections, such as the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Brooklyn Historical Society, the Norton Museum of Art, Corridor Art Gallery, the Museum of Contemporary Art at the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, and the C. Driskell Center for the Study of Visual Culture of African American and African Diaspora, University of Maryland. Delphine is currently an assistant professor of art at Columbia University, New York. Tonight, as Delphine shares her work and journey with us, we'll have the chance to dive into the richly layered stories she brings to life. Through her vision, Delphine guides us to consider identities, beauty, and the future possibility of African diaspora, expanding our understanding and celebrating the cultural lineage that binds us all. Please join me in welcoming Adama Delphine Fawundu. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction.
And thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here to speak to you all. It was an honor to be with the students that I did today. That was such a great experience. Okay, so as a first generation born in Lenape land to parents from Sierra Leone and Equatorial Guinea, and those who embody the cosmologies of the Mende, Bube, Bamileke, and Yoruba, I'm a reflection of cultural hybridity and the child of the African diaspora. So I was born in Brooklyn, New York. I grew up in Crown Heights in a home where Creole was spoken often, and Fela Kuti played often through my parents' parties. I ate fufu, and I also visited neighbors who ate grits and all these things from the diaspora. So I literally grew up in a home where it was this African rich culture, but then as soon as I stepped outside, I was in the diaspora. I got my first start making photographs in my neighborhood. This photo was taken back in the 90s. Particularly 1993 is when I started making photographs. And my photos took me back and forth. Here I am in 2011 in Sierra Leone. But I was very much interested in looking at places and how they reflect across the diaspora and the continent. And I think what it is I've inherited a longing for my parents' connection to home. And so wherever I am, I'm looking for a home. So seeing home in faraway places and through my community of friends who were mostly from people who migrated from the Caribbean and the Black American South, South America, and Africa, is how I started to claim space and develop this idea that home is in many places and that the earth is one in multiple places at once, and thinking about how people move to different spaces to create home. So what's interesting is that in 2021, I was commissioned by the Clear Skies Gallery to make an experimental outdoor work. And I made this work called BK, a BK scroll. And what I thought about was my early photography back in the 90s, where I was documenting hip hop culture and my neighborhood. And I was interested in, I still live in the same place that I grew up, and when I walk up and down Franklin Avenue all the time, I'm thinking about, there's like a hip-hop soundtrack from the 90s playing in my head. I'm thinking about how my community has changed over the years. So what I did to make this role was to use cyanotypes, use negatives, like this right here is the actual negative that I took back in 1994 of kids in the neighborhood, and then there's this hip-hop photograph that is of a group in Brooklyn with the 718. So what I did was made a huge scroll that just lived outside for 3 months. I think it's probably one of the most absurd works that I've made. By the time I took it down, first of all, the window cracked on the case, and also there was like bird people on it. Like it just lived outside, collecting the energy of the wind and people passing by. And to me, there was something quite interesting about that. Also, it includes, here's a full picture of it. It's very long. It's actually wrapped around a couple of times, hanging outside. And but it was an interesting experiment to see what would happen if these things lived outside using various processes. I have photolumens in there, cyanotype, even prints on copy machine paper, just all of these different things to see how do we record and how the ideas fade away in the recording of things. But also, for it to live in this neighborhood that I grew up in and has all of these memories. So I wrote something to it. I rarely write, but for this one, I actually wrote a poem to it, and I'll read some of it to you. So how does one make a scroll? A scroll of memories. I remember when I was the height of my mother's hip, I enjoyed our visits to the meat market, maybe because the panoramic window into the world of all types of raw flesh was in perfect view, or because sliding through sawdust with the sound of a high-pitched blade cutting meat, vibrating seeming like we would be there for hours. Seems like we would be there for hours. The meat market on Franklin Avenue between President and Union is probably one of the oldest storefronts right along with Associated. It was key food before that. I don't think it's true that they didn't think we were worthy of organic food back then. It's just a matter of supply and demand. Mike used to order cases of feed and soy milk in a new container for me back in 1998. I would buy all of them. I don't consume soy anymore. Change is occurring at every moment. In the midst of change, what is important to remember? I remember when I didn't walk past Franklin and Eastern Parkway towards Atlantic unless I really had to. There. I remember playing outside until the streetlights came on. We made games out of everything and anything. Joy. I remember when most of the storefronts on the block were owned by community members. Rob's Sweet Shop, Hills, Nino's, the drugstore. It was good until crack. And then, remember when they shot Mr. Murray from the photo studio right in front of the pizza shop? I've walked by these blocks. I've walked these blocks the most during my existence. What does it mean to walk the same pavement, cross the same streets, through change? I went to junior high school with her and elementary school with him. It's so sad that her daughter was murdered. She was a friend. She was so young, unreal. Carroll Street, my young son loved to watch a shuttle train go by on that small bridge. The conductor would see their little faces pressed against the gate. The sound of his horn would vibrate into bursts of laughter throughout their little bodies. They've grown. Who remembers what remembers? The trees, the buildings, still the same. New names, new structures are not so new. But layered memories, sounds, thoughts. What do they remember? What do we remember? Change is constant. So this is something, it's really interesting to make work in the community in which you live. But what's interesting about this is after I made this, I was asked to do another project in Brooklyn that was not related to hip hop. And this piece is inspired greatly by hip hop as a concept because there's this idea of sampling and remixing. So when I was asked to make it again, now I took this piece that lived outside for 3 months and then cut it and then reconstructed. I added to it. So because it was going to live in this space and it was in an exhibition that was celebrating hip hop culture, the 50th anniversary, I added more of my hip hop images. I added earrings, like all types of things. Started sewing in some raffia from Sierra Leone. And I was thinking about this idea of how the body, our bodies become these elements. Like we are composites, we are collages of all of this knowledge. And what does it mean to have this thing loose and repeated in the space? And so here's like some detail of it. And it was just a different way to experience this work as well. And so then it transforms again. So it's kind of like this piece that just keeps transforming into different shapes. So that's it, the long piece there in the corner. And most recently, right now, actually, it's in Toronto. And because I was going to be in Toronto, I started thinking about the history of people of African descent in Toronto, which brought me to some of the first immigrants to the area or those who were brought there by enslavement. And what stood out to me was a person whose name was his name was Horace Hawkins, and he was enslaved in Kentucky. He escaped to Canada, moved to New York, studied at the University of Rochester, and was critical of racism in Ontario and in New York, and kind of found himself moving back and forth. I was fascinated by the story of how someone escaped slavery, and obviously they understood that when they were in that system, that they were in a sick and absurd system, and knew that they were free, therefore they got their freedom. But the idea of being so mobile at that time was pretty inspiring. So what I did is I found some archival photos, cut into this again, added that to the piece, and still, made it larger. What was interesting about him too was the story of him going back to Kentucky after being freed, and then buying his freedom, actually negotiating his freedom. The cost was $500, and he negotiated down to $200, and then moved back to the north again. So this, to me, that story was really interesting. I'm interested in unpacking these stories, and it's interesting to show this in Toronto, and no one had known about this story. So for me, art is another way to reveal what is uncovered, to kind of do the uncovering. Here's a public art piece that's also in Toronto that goes across with this piece, and this is also a part of larger research that I'm doing, in which I kind of place my body within these different areas within the diaspora as I start to think about the history of the land, of the wind, of the ocean, of everything remembered. I'll share with you some more of my hip-hop work. This is the foundation to my work. I distinctly remember the first time that I heard hip-hop, the classic Rap the Light. I was 8 years old. And I feel like that is the moment in which I fell in love with this cultural phenomenon. So born in 1971, I literally grew up with this thing. And I realized that I was drawn to something that was connected to the fabric of my DNA. The expressive, figurative language, you could tell stories, the syncopated rhythms, the call and response, the drum as a heartbeat, all evolving from indigenous African culture. So I am not surprised that when I discovered I was a photographer in 1993, New York City hip-hop is where I pointed my journey. During the 90s, many black communities were plagued with the crack epidemic and hate crimes were rampant. I was haunted by the deaths of Yusuf Hawkins and Michael Griffith. I cried when the Central Park Five was arrested because I knew that they were innocent. At the time, hip-hop echoed crack as black in response to the epidemic, free South Africa to the apartheid regime, and black is back to racism and colorism. It was a space of rebellion and freedom of expression, a space that told alternative stories to the mainstream media and focused on negative stereotypes and racism. I fell in love with photography because of my enjoyment of documentary films such as Marlon Briggs' Black is Black Ink, and I was inspired to tell stories often untold. I knew that this golden era of hip-hop was important, and I treated it like the jazz photographers, Anthony Barboza, Kwame Brathwaite did. Understanding the power of my focus, I documented every moment that I could, and in the early 2000s, like 2006, I became aware of a hip-hop scene growing in Accra, Ghana. My love for the culture and curiosity of what I call a spiritual cipher made me want to investigate. I say spiritual cipher as I think of hip-hop as a symbolic shapeshifter, using coded language and syncopated rhythms rooted in West African culture such as Mann. Magical is how hip-hop travels back in a new way, coded for receiving ears who become inspired to create something fresh. So in 2008, I began a 10-year journey of documenting hip-hop and urban youth culture in Ghana, in Bamako, Dakar, Addis Ababa, Johannesburg, Nairobi, Freetown, and Nigeria. So this series reveals how young Africans use the sonic movement to inspire self-empowerment and entrepreneurship to strive for growth and justice in their post-colonial nations. We could argue about whether it's post-colonial or not. So next I'm going to go into a different phase. So this Gullah Praise House on St. Helena Island is juxtaposed against the Atlantic Ocean, where it meets the Brooklyn shore. At the borders where an annual tribute to the ancestors ritual takes place. A homage to those who were enslaved, constructed of wooden panels, just like the Board House or the Board House in Freetown, Sierra Leone, the Praise House and the spiritual space of worship for the Gullah people, many of whom descended from the Mende people of Sierra Leone. I meditates on open, green, natural space once the Turner Plantation in Southampton, Virginia, where the abolitionists
The Mono River flows from the Guinea Highlands through Liberia, Sierra Leone, and convenes with the Atlantic. She's wrapped in a dress and a headscarf, hand-dyed by her grandma Adama. Distance, cost, and a horrific civil war kept them apart, but Grandma Adama's textiles always remained with her. Mom wore that dress back in the 70s and 80s. She wears the dress because her grandma's hands made them. She embodies a Wende woman who appeared on the Nat Turner's plantation, a spiritual being. Passageways, the stories, the secrets, the truths, the untruths, the told and untold stories. Sometimes through whispers, sometimes metaphysically. So I enjoy using video and sound as a storytelling medium. With the cleanse, I thought about the cyclical idea of ritual as it mirrors the cycle of life. I created my own language made up of natural elements and diasporic references as metaphors and symbols. Like a hip-hop artist, I sampled trap music, spiritual text, Mende harvest chants, and words from authors such as James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Erykah Badu, Alice Walker, Sojourner Truth, Wendy Lord, and Gail Jones. These words are juxtaposed against vivid imagery of hair, water, blood, milk, and cotton. The cleanse is about healing as a natural occurrence. So this is my first video. This was actually on view outside of the Brooklyn Museum, but it was also on view at different locations. So I'll play a little snippet of it for you.
Where there is a woman, there is magic. If there is a moon falling from her mouth, she is a woman who knows her magic. Who can share or not share her power. A woman with a moon falling from her mouth, roses between her legs, and tiaras of Spanish moss. This woman is a consort of the spirits. And there are three that bear witness: the earth, the spirit, and the water, and the blood, and these three agree in one. And he who sends down from time to time water from the sky in due measure, and be raised to life therewith a land that is dead. Even so will you be raised from the dead. There is neither time nor place for us here, unless we create it. I found God in myself, and I loved her. I loved her fiercely. I loved her fiercely.
sampling, constructing, deconstructing, piecing together powerful energies from the diaspora here is important. It's an important part of my work. It carries memory, it protects, it continues to grow, and for some of us, it defies gravity. Here we are, energies, mass, life, shaping life, mind shaping mind, God shaping God. Consider, we are not born. We are born not with purpose, but with potential. I pray this Father. I love and I'm often inspired by writers. I think Butler is one of my favorites. Toni Morrison is like from those Black Gail Jones. I borrow so much of their text, and I do sometimes as I'm creating titles for my work. Shapeshifter, Mono, a small island surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean and the Mono River. Her great-great-grandfathers settled there a generation before colonial rule. A chicken sits caught comfortably in her hands for the first time ever. Its softness and steady heartbeat comforts her. She is clawed in a Manduaka dress designed by Rema. The carriage dog from Freetown sees clearly through the Spanish mark that once hung from trees in Savannah. Salon Raffia holds the soft ball of her hair and handsome face. Lost and found in the archive, in the face of history, constructed from historical documents printed on fabric and paper, she bears witness. Documents range from the antebellum American South and the Berlin Conference to the mid-20th century. So this project in the face of history is another one that has transformed over the years. I started off with this impulse to just screen print these portraits of my head onto these documents. And it's just me. For me, sometimes I think it's just my love for the archives that gave me an excuse to go find all of these documents. But, in the way that I search for documents is I'll find some point in history, and I want to see what happens around that. And I just learned so much from this. So the first iteration was in Connecticut, where I just kind of made this whole wall. And I wanted it to be performative, not so much for myself, but for the viewers. And what happened is everyone just kept going close and looking and reading the document. And this also was kind of something to transform. So because I was here, I researched documents that actually pointed to New Haven, but then also had global documents at the same time. So I often think about how moments of progress by a woman of African descent are omitted from the retelling of these historical events. So what happened here is when I printed these on cotton, I was commissioned by the Park Avenue Armory to create a project that would help to commemorate 100 years since women were given the right to vote. So this project was supposed to be on view during 2020, and then the pandemic happened. And so rather than, what I was going to do was make a tapestry rather than having them on the wall. I was like, what if I stitch these together, make it hang in the space, and I wanted it to move and have light coming through it to kind of give it this, this thing that was moving on its own. But then that plan got derailed by the pandemic because we couldn't do it in person anymore. So they asked us to do something that would be digital. And I was pondering, what will I do for this? And so I was thinking I still want to make a textile, but what can I do that could be performative? And what if I made a video? What would the video be? And then I landed on the idea of making the textile into a cape, because I thought about what can I make that one could wear that could embody some type of power and, that I could perform it. So I ended up making this cape and performing it in Prospect Park, which is right in my neighborhood. So Prospect Park, which was my local park and still is, became also my studio and space for experimentation. And so here are different views of this cape. What's really interesting about this is that this house here is a Lefferts house. And when I decided to make a photograph in front of it, I thought about the idea of the park itself being a historical document, the house being another historical archive, and what it meant to layer these things, right? So I was forced to look around me. I'm so used to traveling to make this work, but
moment, lots of us are in agreement that we need to vote to get rid of Trump.
We have a lot of work to do so people really understand the power of their voice and the power of their vote. They're one and the
I
same.
do believe we definitely have power, like in the box and whatnot, but I feel like especially in these past few years, and as like a person who's in college, like I'm constantly toying the line between even believing in the electoral college as a system that's like right, because how can you win the popular vote? Like just simple questions like that are like enrage me.
And to me, voting is a very powerful form of protest because it's a way to hold people accountable who don't live up to their obligations.
So I've heard someone say that if you're protesting and you don't vote, sit down. And I disagree with that type of thinking. If it wasn't for the protesters, we wouldn't be here where we're at right
It's
now.
not a matter of if you protest and don't vote, sit down. It's more a matter of what is the follow through.
My belief in grassroots organizing and the fact that that's always been and that like may be the most effective right now.
My pronouns are they, them. I'm a first generation Afro-Latinx living in this country.
I am first generation American. My parents were immigrants from Belize, from
I
Central
was born in
America.
Haiti. I came here when I was 14. I naturalized in my early 20s.
So I think that voting is important through the eyes of my parents and the work they did to become American citizens. So through those lens, I think voting is important.
Just going to be
I'll stop it there, but what's interesting about that piece is that it's, here we are again, right? In the same elections year. And when I first made this, it was 2020 when we were going towards the election, the whole thing with Trump versus Biden. And I was interested in, as I was making that piece around, voting and just having the right to vote, I wanted to talk to women and non-binary people of African descent to hear what they had to say and juxtapose that around the mission of the case. And that brings me to this reimagined leftist house project that I did. So the house, the front of the house is where I initially took the photo with the cake back in 2020. And I just did that intuitively, but it got published in Vogue. And then the director of this house saw the image and said, hey, what's going on? Like, because here she is seeing this house. And so they invited me. She told me that they were on this trajectory of reimagining the leftist house, and she was so interested in having me be on the advisory committee to help think through this project. And then they invited me afterwards to be the first artist in residence. So one of the things that I did was to think about, not only are we now showing that video in the house and the actual case is on view in the house, but I was interested in the history of the house. And so we found that 25 people were enslaved in this house. And that was something that was not known to the general public. From my own research before having this encounter, I only found 2 people, Anna and Isaac. And so we found 25 people who had birth records, escape records, all types of information. So what I wanted to do was then cover the whole house and with tapestries. And so there's 25 in the front, and each one is in homage to each person who was enslaved there. But to open up the space, we did it in a traditional African way. This is what it's like to be on the other side. This is the front. That's the front of it, and this is inside. On the actual porch, you're just surrounded by all of these textiles, and they move with the wind, and it's just a space of healing. And that's really what I wanted to do, is to have the space of healing. But to open up the space, it was important. But it was important for me to. So imagine like this being on that side. Sometimes it's calm, sometimes, it's such an experience to be on the porch. But to open the space, it was important for me to go into, traditional ways of doing libation. So there's no way I was going to open up the space without doing a libation. So in Sierra Leone, we call it Sarah, and it's a way to honor ancestors. So on this day, we gathered the community, everyone made a circle, and we said the names of each person 3 times as we were pouring the water. I started performing with my son. So it's my son who had he's a composer and a violinist, but when he plays the violin, it does not sound like a violin. It sounded like the sounds were coming from the grass, from the trees, from the sky. It was just such a beautiful experience. And my mother is sitting on the porch, and she actually opened the space and explained what Sarah is to the public. So it was this real community event that took place where I live, where I grew up, and on these grounds that I grew up in, and with people who all felt like community, so it was a real celebration. And then later on, just last month, we had a cake making activity where the community came out and started constructing their own cakes, which was really fun. So here's some photos from that. And what was special is this young 5-year-old who went on his own to the corner, in the corner I have some of an altar, and he just went and just started meditating on his own, which I found wow. So this is a true community project. I feel like this is one of the most immersive community projects and engaging projects that I've done. Every weekend this place is being activated. To date, over 10,000 community members have visited the space and interacted in their own way. And for me, this is why I make art, because I want to engage community in a real way. I feel like for me, spaces, just as the museum and galleries are important, actual community engagement in the most authentic way is extremely important for me. So I'm going to move a little bit to photography. So even though all of that is photography in its own way, what I didn't say about those tapestries is that they're all made out of my archives. I'm constructing and making all of these patterns out of my archive that I collect as I travel to all of these different places around the African diaspora. Now here, this series is me being in conversation with my grandmother's textiles. And so my grandmother, Adama, I only met her twice in my life, but what I have from her are her textiles. She was known for her batiking and tie-dyeing, and in her community, she was known by her name. If someone saw the dress, they knew that that's Adama's dress because her style was so unique. So I started thinking about ways to engage with her work, and so these are screen prints of her patterns on top of silver gelatin. So I made negatives out of her textiles and then started playing with this overlaying and patterning. And every time I'm thinking about that and the way that textiles are made, I'm still thinking about the body and how complex. We like to think that we're one thing, but who is, right? And we are these complex beings that are made with so much knowledge. And sometimes I'm wondering, what does it mean to tap into some of this ancestral knowledge and think about how we move forward from there, right? How do we look at our existence and the way that we commune with each other and the land through a lens that is not one of destruction. So this whole series is me experimenting with her textiles and some of my own pattern making through my photographs on cyanotype and the textiles I use is a guinea brocade that I got from Sierra Leone. So it has its own layer in it, and then I'm working on top of that, even with inkjets, running that through the inkjet printer, something that who is supposed to run wax prints through an inkjet printer. Here I am experimenting in all types of ways, keeping my fingers crossed that I don't break my printer. But it ended up working out. And here's some more forms, printing on rice paper, but then going over the rice paper. So I'm constantly patterning and repatterning. These are photolumens that I screen printed on and then even sewed into and all types of making, and experimentation. And which led me to for Mama Adama Hymns and Parables, where I started making these panels and then constructing them to be these long tapestry has materials from so many different places. So when I travel to West Africa, I'm always visiting herb markets. So I'll have herbs. Those herbs are in there. Spanish moss from Savannah, raffia. All types of these things are constructed into one piece, and it becomes this whole collage and this embodiment of so much. Here's some details with that. So I've incorporated her fabrics to make large film negatives and positives in order to use a variety of photographic processes to create a new design and pattern based on her original work. And so much of this work is about creating new patterns and new languages while activating my body and ancestral memory. And so my process includes allowing my body to move intuitively. It performs and makes gestures through these camera-less photographic techniques. While making this work, I think about the complex nature of identity as well as the multi-layered connection between African and Caribbean. And my installations are quite immersive. They are meditative. They allow you to sit and just reflect. Even if you don't know my story, it's about your own story. My solo exhibition was 2 years ago at the Norton Museum within the Global African Arts Collection, and it was on view for a year. The works in this exhibition connect to the Sierra Leonean modern artist Miranda Olayinka and influences by Mende and Yoruba culture that was in their collection. So similar to Olayinka, I'm interested in the world's view of the Mende and several indigenous cultures. As we broaden our perspective through various cosmologies, we can think critically about the post-colonial mindset and the image and imagine holistic, equitable, and sustainable futures. So how do we become conscious of the indigenous intelligence within our DNA and imagine outside of a westernized colonial construct? And, how do we think about the power within? So this work was made incorporating materials and spaces that represent histories of resilience, spirituality, and freedom. Embodying personas of power and water deities, I conjure who were the ancient women philosophers, conjurers, and healers. And here. So, Vata Badi, water bodies. I am Adama Delphine Fawundu. I am aware that Mende, Bube, Banuleke cosmologies are intertwined within the fabric of my DNA. I am unaware of the parts of my ancestral being that transformed into my grandpa, Joseph Calco, a descendant of Afro-Cubanos, who really traveled back to Equatorial Guinea to conjoin spirits with my grandma, Manuelita Cuba, and gave birth to my mother, Maria Valcarce. My spirit feels aligned as the ocean breeze whispers in my ear when my body travels within landscapes of Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Mali, and Ghana. The sea islands, St. Helena, and Tafusti provoke familiar memories that I can't quite grasp. I am calm. My spirit is calm within the green fields of Virginia and South Carolina. I often wonder why Sicily feels like home. I am both mesmerized and horrified by the songs that the ocean sings, whether it be the Atlantic, Mediterranean, or the Indian. The hums of the rivers, Mississippi, Mino, and the Hudson make me question exactly what do they remember. This is an excerpt of a short film that I have called Cosmic Echoes. And it's like thinking about all of these spaces of resilience. I came across the story of the people of Malaga Island in Maine. It's off the coast of Maine. And there was a community of people of mixed race. Like there were people of European descent, people of African descent who moved off to an island and wanted to just live on their own and, thrive. And the people from the mainland came and removed them, and even condemned them of being imbeciles. And so I was interested in this history, and I went to Mawada Island. So a lot of the footage that you see that was green and underwater was on footage that I took underneath the waters from the coast of Maine to Mawada Island. I did a residency at Indigo Arts Alliance where I worked with an artist, Daniel Minter, who is actively preserving this history. So some of this video calls to that, but it also is looking at different parts. So this video, you'll see Cuba, you'll see South Carolina, you'll see Maine, all of these places kind of intertwine to make this immersive story that is so influenced by water, which is a connector for us all. Most recently, I was in the Malta Biennial, which was the first time that they had this biennial, and I made a similar video, but this time thinking about the Mediterranean. This is the first time that I had a chance to work with the Mediterranean, and the textile was made in a similar fashion of the Mama Adama pieces, but it was actually, way taller, more tactile. I'm always expanding on different ideas and, these types of pieces. So it's always something, my work is always growing using my archives, which consists of photographs, videos, and materials that I collect throughout my travels. So I will end here. I'm not talking too much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Delphine. The floor is open, everyone. Who has questions? Who wants to start it off?
For the places that you choose to put your pieces in, is there a lot of consideration and things that you look for specifically when you're talking about
Yes. So many times, like for example, this, when I was invited to go to Malta to be at the biennial, it was important for me to research that space, to think about my connection to the space, and sometimes it's far reaching. Like just through research, I found that the same person, it's so weird, but the same person who was once a general, from a British general in Sierra Leone, was also a British general in Malta. And the time period was so interesting. So I ended up going deep into the archives. I was also interested in the agriculture and just the stories that exist in indigenous cultures within Malta, because it's a place that has been colonized over and over. Something that was appealing to me about it was that, Malta is this island. And I was thinking about Mano, where the Fawundu was from, but was also an island. Again, it was my first time working with the Mediterranean, so there was so much. So even me being there and being immersed in the Mediterranean Ocean was interesting for me. So the work, when people see the work, if they're from Malta, they see where they're from in the work. But they're also seeing places that may not be recognizable, but maybe, and that's something that I always do, is kind of research where, whenever I do have a chance to do something like that, I'm always researching where I'm going to show. More questions?
I have one.
Yeah.
I was curious if for the early hip-hop photography, which I love, was it being published? Were you commissioned? How did that work? Was that just you on your own, or where did it end up?
Yeah, so the first works that I got published was for the Source magazine and for Vibe, for Beat Down. Those are the magazines that I worked with. They definitely were commissioned. But I also always had my camera. And because I had access, the reason why I had access, like how I started as a photographer, at first I wanted to do documentary film because for me that was a way to tell these stories. I just knew I wanted to tell stories, right? And then I ended up doing an internship at a record company because I was doing an internship at the Cosby Show, of all places, right? And the person who I was working with there ended up working at a record company. She said, "Do you want to come and work here?"
And I said, sure, like I love music and I thought it was interesting. And then one day this photographer came in with all of these images and she sold them. And I realized that I had images that were similar. So I was like, well, maybe I could do this too. And it was something that I knew that just because of the way that I was interested in histories and stories, and I knew that something was happening in hip hop. Like I knew that it would, we're talking about the 90s, like the golden era, right? And I knew that there would be a 50th anniversary of this thing. I understood what jazz did, I understood what the blues was, and I knew that this was a continuation of that, so that it was important to document it. So there were times that I photographed, particularly for magazines, but I always had my camera, and whenever I had access, I was documenting. And some of the photos that I published, some of them were never published before, like the one on the stoop with all of the, like Lauryn Hill, is like all of these different people on the stoop in Brooklyn. That wasn't published and exhibited until the 2000s, you know, so, but I knew that I was making an archive, you know, so that was really, something that was really important for me back then. And it was an interesting time to be 20-something years old, you know, photographing all of these people, you know, running around with my camera, and but back then I funded my photography through selling images, you know, and publishing. Yeah.
There was a picture you took of a Driskell Art performance,
Mm-hmm.
and in the background you just kind of see people dancing. I love that photo, but do you ever feel like those types of energies coming through, like say, do you ever feel those energies coming through when say you're like sitting on the porch? Or do you think as you've grown up you kind of don't feel like it's a different type of energy for you now?
It's the same energy. And that's what I realized. For a long time, I struggled with how do I, and this is why I show all the work together, because for a long time, I was thinking that the work I was doing now is very different from then, but I realized I'm just continuing the conversation. Yeah, so it's definitely the same energy. And something really special about that photo, first of all, I love that photo too, but the most interesting thing about that photo is that I was in an exhibition at Photographica, and they wanted to show some of my hip hop images, and then there was somebody who was on the other side and has that same photo, but it's a different perspective, and I saw myself in that photo taking it, and because when I saw it, I said, oh my gosh, this is the other perspective. That means I'm there somewhere, and I literally went up and saw this tiny picture of my 20-something-year-old self photographing the other perspective. So those types of things are fun to see too. But yeah, this is all the same energy. Thanks for that question. Yeah, so talk about the love of my life. My goodness, this is the beginning of my photography career. And I've been grappling with how to show that archive, and I think I finally got it figured out. At first, I thought when I was photographing all of these images in Africa, that I would show those together, and then it was like, no, it doesn't make sense together, show this one, and that. So now those two archives are so near and dear to me, and it took me to do all of this work to realize that it's literally my life story. So I'm figuring it out now, how to show those images, and the words are not necessarily, it's not about the music, it's about this journey, and it's about these interwoven stories, and, you know, about who I am being placed, like this symbol, you know, in the diaspora, you know, it's a layered story. So yes, soon come. Soon come, but it's one of the most difficult things to think about, is how to actually show it in a way that I feel would be good, and it would be in book form too. And it's going to force me to write, which, you know. Yes.
I'm really fascinated by the transformation of your work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's big because I feel like the world is constantly changing. Things are never staying the same. And I just was wondering if you put that into consideration, when you're creating work, when you first started making it, change and temporariness, and that
interesting. I think, something that I would encourage you all to do is to work in the most honest way possible. And to me, it's hard for me to just do one thing over and over and over again. And I am driven by these ideas that come into my brain, and sometimes the idea to sit there and sew textiles and paper and all of these things together, it's just something that I have to do. It's like this compulsion, right? And so I'm following it. I'm going with the change. I'm going with the transformation, and who knows what's going to come next. And I like that, like the idea that I don't know what I'm going to be making next year. Because every time, everyone has their own way of making, but every time I plan and I say, I'm going to do this, that's not going to happen, Maybe that gets me to my studio, but I'm open to the possibilities of what will come, So yes, I'm open and going with the change and the transformation. Yeah. Yeah, it's very different, and that's why I don't care to do it anymore, because I stopped being interested the minute that it became all, it was so commercialized, and to me it was no more fun, like when a photo shoot requires sponsors and all of these other things. I was into the rawness of it, right? And in the early 2000s it started to shift, and so I just started pointing my lens somewhere else, unless I was in a space where it felt more authentic. So I'm not into all the lights and the bling bling and all of that other stuff. That wasn't interesting to me anymore. Especially because during the height of the bling era, and we see what was happening if we pay attention to the news, right? We see that some really shady things were happening. But at the height of the bling bling era was also the height of the Civil War in Sierra Leone over diamonds. And I don't think that was by accident. So, it's interesting to think about, who's running record companies, what messages are being promoted, and what's actually happening in the world. So there's this extraction of diamonds, but yet it's a commercialization of diamonds. And that really disturbed me at the time, being from that place. And it also kind of just pushed me away from that whole message and, all the hyper-capitalism and everything. I just wasn't interested in that. And I don't think that's hip-hop. I'm a real hip-hop head, and we'll have a long conversation of what qualifies as hip-hop, because I don't even think it's really being made today. You have to really look for it. Yes. I did not, unfortunately. Am I missing someone? I don't know. Someone said something?
Can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you, yes.
Right. So over the summer, I had a chance to see this documentary by Dream Hampton called "It Was All a Dream," and it was all footage that she captured of her time at the Source magazine. She captured a variety of different hip hop acts, and she gravitated most towards Biggie and Junior Mafia. That's the majority of what you see in that film. I'm curious to know, as a photographer during that time, were there any particular artists that you gravitated towards that you captured most of?
Oh yeah, I mean, I feel like, I definitely saw that film. I was at the opening. Dream was a friend of mine. And, I knew her back then. It was a very small community of people who were either writing about hip-hop or photographing it. And it's interesting because I was interested in so much. If you look at my archive, there are going to be many people that some of you may not know. There's the people that you may not know unless you were there. And I didn't gravitate towards anyone. I was I photographed Mobb Deep before I even heard their album. Who knew they were going to be who they were, right? There's so many people that I photographed. When I photographed the Fugees for the first time, I had no idea. But it was because the only qualification was that you were making this music, that you were authentic to what you were doing. And New York was a very small scene, and it was a thing to make music in New York. And we even looked at, music coming from the West Coast differently because, and not anything about this East Coast, West Coast thing, but just in terms of,
you know, when it began to do things that was not necessarily about the community, you know? So because it was like, or when people started making the same thing over and over, that was whack. You know what I mean? Like, you had to be original. So as a young person myself, who was an artist, who was interested and attracted to originality, you didn't have to fit a certain thing, right? When I took the photos of all those women, it was a time when, you know, women was saying, which is one critique that I have of that film, is that, you know, there were so many different women who were saying things, right? And they could have also been centered in the film, not necessarily just in one scene, but throughout the film, because there were so many women, right? Either be in front of the mic or, you know, writing and all of that. So it was not, I can't say that I was actually looking to photograph, like I photographed Nas before I knew who he was, right? It was the buzz on the street. Nas is the next Rakim. Okay, we're gonna photograph this guy. You understand? But it was not so much like I have to photograph this person because of this, right? So everything was forming and unfolding at that time, and we didn't know who was gonna be what. It was just like, these people are doing something, they're part of this movement. Yeah.
Yeah, I was most interested in the use of textiles and fabrics and stuff like that. And I was just wondering how you got into that and like your influences there and that stuff.
Yeah, so the textiles are definitely influenced by my grandmother. I don't know, one day when I was just like you all, I was in my studio at Columbia, and I was just thinking about what is my language. And what I did is I just started writing down all of these ideas that I was interested in, not necessarily through subject matter, but what I noticed in my work. And some of the things that I noticed were, or these themes that I was interested in were patterns, repetition, right? And then I started thinking about how textiles do all of that, right? There's this repetition, layering, layers, repetition, and patterns, right? And we could go on and on about how that represents our bodies and it represents land, right? You could go and look at the land on the surface, but once you start digging, you start looking at who was there before. It's so many layers going this way and this way, right? So I started, you know, in my studio, I had this table, and the table was covered with one of the textiles that my grandmother made. I had a mask that I had from Sierra Leone. I had pictures of my mom and my dad from back in the 70s. I had my baby pictures. All of this was just inspiration. And anytime people would come into my studio, sometimes they wouldn't even go and look at the work on the wall. They kept saying, this is where the work is. And so for me, it was just my comfort space, because I didn't even know what to do in the studio. I was used to making photos in the way that I made them, like go out and make photos. I didn't know what I was going to do in my studio. And but so what I then started really paying attention to the textiles, which is something that I've always had. Like I've had of hers, over 50 years worth of textile. Well, 6 textiles that are over 50 years old. Textiles that my mom wore that was made by her, and the idea that these textiles traveled across the ocean, and how my mom would send certain things to my grandmother and to my aunt, and then they would send textiles back. So just that landed me on the textiles, and that's what started my interest in them. So I wasn't necessarily interested in replicating how they were made, but more so using the way of making as an inspiration to use my photographs in the same way. And that's, from there, it just kind of, and now I'm making textiles out of so many different things that are not fabric. You know, paper and plastic bag, like all types of things. And who knows where that language will go. But it's a wonderful way and tool to use. Yeah. Someone had, okay, yeah.
What process did you go through to reenact it through archival footage? How long did you spend?
So the photographs, I spend a lot of time in the, with the microfiche film, and just, anytime I'm next to a library and I have time, So I use Columbia's library, I use the Library of Congress, sometimes I'm online, like just doing deep dives, so that's one way. Also, in terms of the footage, though, I make my own footage. So wherever I travel with my camera, and I'm always, the question for me is, what does movement look like, you know, on Earth? Like, how does the wind show that it's moving? And for me, it's through the ocean, it's through the trees, sometimes it's people walking really slow. So there are these things that I have in my mind, and when I see it, just sometimes I make a photograph, but sometimes I'm also just being still and, you know, gathering this footage at the same time. And so over the years, I've been building an archive that I go to pull from. And so for example, for my next, if I was to make a film, one of these short films, at the time, I'm going into my archive to make it, and then I might need new ones. So it's kind of this continued building and, you know, shaping from this archive. And I think there was a question over here somewhere.
I have another question.
Yes.
What camera do you use to shoot your footage?
So I have a Sony A7R3. Yes. And the reason why I have it is because it does really good slow motion. But I'm about to make another film, and I'm going to upgrade to a bigger camera. I'm looking at Sony's, but on bumping up the production values, because it's going to be a film that's going to be more pointed outwards, and I'm going to actually have a crew and do all of that. It's like a film, but not really a film, experimental film. But I'm going to go up a little bit on the thing, so I'm still researching. And I also I have an 8mm camera. I don't think I didn't show any footage of that, but I have a 8mm camera that I use. That's 8mm film, and that's very exciting to use. And then I realized the other day that my mini DV still works, and I was so excited, like how, you know, that looks. So I'm gonna experiment with that still. A lot of the early footage that I didn't share, I have a whole bunch of footage that I made on these small little mini DV tapes that are really exciting. Any more questions?
Last call for questions.